My name's Eli, and today we're going to be looking at the zero, first, second, third, and mixed conditionals. So, all the conditionals. Big task. But to help me is Bob. As you can see, Bob is in prison. He got caught robbing a bank, and so now he's serving a 20-year sentence in prison. So he will be in prison for 20 years. So, we know he's in prison and he will be in prison for 20 years. So we can say, if he waits for 20 years, he will be free. Here we have the first conditional. If he waits for 20 years, he will be free. The first conditional describes a possible event in the present or future. In this case, it refers to the future. If he waits 20 years, he will be free. Let's continue with the story. Don't worry about the form now, we will cover that later in the video. So, he's in prison for 20 years for robbing banks. The problem is he loves robbing banks. It's his favourite thing to do. So we can say, if he wasn't in prison, he would rob more banks. Right, we have another conditional. If he wasn't in prison, he would rob more banks. This is the second conditional. It describes a hypothetical idea in the present or future. Is he in prison now? Yes. Can he rob more banks? No. So it's hypothetical. If he wasn't in prison, which he is, he would rob more banks, which he can't, because he's in prison. Again, don't worry about the form for now, we will cover that later in this video. Let's continue with the story. So why did he rob banks? Well, he wanted more than anything to be rich. He probably wanted one of those gold iPhones or something. So he wanted to be rich, and as a result, he robbed banks. So here we can say, if he hadn't wanted to become rich, he wouldn't have robbed banks. This is the third conditional. It describes hypothetical events in the past. If he hadn't wanted to become rich, he wouldn't have robbed banks. Did he want to become rich? Yes. Did he rob banks? Yes. So it's hypothetical. So anyway, poor Bob has to stay in prison for 20 years. But it's his own fault really. Everyone knows if you rob banks, you go to prison. And here you have the zero conditional. The zero conditional describes a general circumstance or rule. If you rob banks, you go to prison. It's a rule. So that covers the first, second, third, and zero conditional. But what about mixed conditionals? Here Bob can help us too. We can say, I wouldn't be surprised if Bob tries to escape from prison. Or, if Bob tries to escape from prison, I wouldn't be surprised. The first clause, if Bob tries to escape from prison, follows the structure of the first conditional. That is to say, it's possible or likely. Then the second clause, I wouldn't be surprised, follows the form of the second conditional. So here we're mixing the first conditional in the if clause and the second conditional in the main clause. Okay, we can also mix the second and third conditionals. We know Bob is in prison now, and that's because he robbed banks in the past. So we can say, if he hadn't robbed banks, he wouldn't be in prison now. This is describing the present consequence of a hypothetical event in the past. If he hadn't robbed the bank, which he did, he wouldn't be in prison now, which he is. So the if clause refers to the past and therefore uses the third conditional. But the main clause, also known as the conditional clause, uses the second conditional. It describes a hypothetical consequence in the present. He wouldn't be in prison now. So we have the third conditional in the if clause and the second conditional in the main clause. But we can also have it the other way around. We can say, if he didn't love robbing banks, he wouldn't have gone to prison. So now, the if clause uses the second conditional, if he didn't love robbing banks, which he does. It's a general statement about his personality. Then, in the main clause, we have the third conditional. We're talking about the past. Right, there we have it, all the conditionals. Let's quickly run through them before we look at their form. The first, if he waits 20 years, he will be free. The second, if he wasn't in prison, he would rob more banks. The third, if he hadn't wanted to become rich, he wouldn't have robbed banks. And the zero conditional, if you rob banks, you go to prison. So, the form. A general rule about all conditionals is that we can start with the if clause or the main clause. For example, we can say, if he waits for 20 years, he will be free, or he will be free if he waits for 20 years. Note that if we start with the consequence clause, also known as the main clause, then we don't put a comma between the two clauses. But if we start with the if clause, then we do. See? Comma, no comma. So, the first conditional. If he waits for 20 years, he will be free. We have if plus the present simple, then will plus the bare infinitive. The second conditional. If he wasn't in prison, he would rob more banks. We have if plus the past simple, then would plus the infinitive. Now, many of my students get confused here with the idea that we use the past simple to express the present or the future. For example, if he wasn't in prison. Here we're talking about the present. He is in prison. This is because when we express hypothetical situations in English, we take the tense one back. So, for example, when we express a hypothetical event in the present, we use the past simple. When we express a hypothetical event in the past, we use the past perfect. We backshift the tense when we express hypothetical situations. Also note that when we use the verb to be in hypothetical situations, we can use was or were. For example, we can say, if he wasn't in prison, or if he weren't in prison. Both of these mean the same thing, although the use of were is slightly more formal. Right, back to the third conditional. The third conditional is, if he hadn't wanted to become rich, he wouldn't have robbed banks. We have if plus had plus the past participle, then would plus have plus the past participle. Again, notice the backshift in tense. We're talking about the past, so we use the past perfect. If he hadn't wanted to become rich, hadn't wanted is the past perfect. Then the zero conditional. If you rob banks, you go to prison. If plus the present simple, then the present simple. So that's the form of the main conditionals. When we mix conditionals, we take the structure of the clauses that we're mixing. So for example, if we mix the third and the second, if he hadn't robbed banks, he wouldn't be in prison now. We have the third conditional, if he hadn't robbed banks, and the second conditional, he wouldn't be in prison now. We have if plus had plus the past participle, which is the third conditional, then would plus the infinitive, which is from the second conditional. Similarly, if we mix the second and the third conditional, if he didn't love robbing banks, he wouldn't have gone to prison. We have the first clause from the second conditional. If he didn't love robbing banks, we use if plus the past simple. He wouldn't have gone to prison. We have would plus have plus the past participle. So that covers the form of all of the conditionals. Sometimes you will see other modal verbs like can or might used in place of will or would in conditional sentences. So what's that all about? Well, will can be replaced by can, may, might, shall or must, and would can be replaced by might, should, could or must. For example, we can use may, might, or could to reduce the certainty that something will happen. Compare these two sentences. If he waits for 20 years, he will be free, and if he waits for 20 years, he might be free. The use of might here makes it less certain that Bob will be free. Or we can use can or could to refer to ability. For example, instead of saying, if Bob wasn't in prison, he would rob more banks, we can say, if Bob wasn't in prison, he could rob more banks. Using could suggests that he's got the ability, he would be able to rob banks, not that he necessarily would. For more on the use of modal verbs, see my video on modal verbs. Right, a little task before you go. Finish these sentences in the comment box below. Number 1. If you can speak fluent English, you can or can't. If I improve my English, I will, won't. If I could speak every language in the world, I would or wouldn't. And if I hadn't watched this video, I would have or I wouldn't have. Remember, this video does come with a worksheet with exercises, exam tips, teaching advice and activities. Thanks a lot, and don't forget to subscribe. See you soon.